So what we're going to do today, first of all, where's the attendance sheet? Is that it? Who needs it? I'm sure somebody, you need it? Oh, okay. Anybody else need it? Then I will take it. I mean, I'll put it right here in case you have anybody sort of waltz in. All right. To begin with, I sent you an email this morning around 9:15. It should be in your inbox. It's called something like bib example, then the date. You'll open that up. Now, a couple thoughts on that while you're making that happen. There are two documents there. You got to open both of them if you would. It's two different bib examples. What we're going to do today, first, a brief recap of what we did in Monday's class, and I know you all know this because you all watch the videos, and if you don't, I mean this with sincerity. What the fuck? Gotta watch this. Anyway, what we did Monday, we looked at two bib examples. This was Vonnegut and Jarvis, and we used those in that class to outline a body paragraph, okay? What we're gonna do today is similar. We have two different bib examples, two different texts, so not Vonnegut, not Jarvis. I've never wanted to assassinate a person more. That's probably not true. Oh, this is gonna kill me though. All right, sorry. What we're gonna do today, you are kidding me, is look at these two different texts and use them to talk about how to build an introduction to this paper, right? My goal at the end of this week, talk about body paragraphs Monday, talk about introductions today. That's 90 to 95% of the paper right there, right? You're gonna feel better about, I hope, how to do, right? So there's two phases to this. All I want you to worry about right now, hopefully you got those two bibs up. You're gonna read through these bibs, pull out any ideas or even beginnings of arguments that you can see, okay? They may not be completely developed because this is just a note-taking tool, okay? They may only be mentioned, but any claims you can spot. Go ahead and write those down somewhere. We're gonna get them up on the board. Take a couple minutes. All right. Either one, Rees or Grant. Ideas, arguments, claims, even the beginning of an argument may not be fully developed. These are notes after all. They're not, it's not a paper. What'd you guys find? Take your time, we've got plenty of it. We can start with what either one of these articles is about. Let's talk about Rees. That might be a little easier to begin with. What's the Rees article about? Okay. It's troubling. To be clear, I'm not asking like a summary. Like, what's it about? What's Rees talking about?
We're talking about German POWs.
POWs, German POWs, like real prisoners of war in World War II, right? They were captured by Americans and sort of hijinks ensue, right? Some weird stuff kind of happened, okay? Now, what happened? And if you don't like that, then by all means, what do we say about any of that stuff? But I'll even accept what happened first. Somebody's going to really succeed by the end of this montage. I just want you to know. That's what that music was. She's going to study, and she's going to work hard at night, and she's going to ace that test or whatever. Like, that's what that garbage movie was. Anyway. Okay. Now, it's putting pressure on you guys. You guys are my good class. This is bumming me out.
Germans who are described as like physically fit?
Yeah. Where are they described that way? We can start there. That's good.
In like the newspapers.
What newspapers?
The Mail.
Good. And that's kind of weird, right? Like at worst, that's noteworthy. That American newspapers at the time would describe German POWs, so dudes that we've captured. These are the enemy. How do we describe them?
As youthful and veterans and fine specimen of physical movement.
Yeah, that all sounds nice, right? Complimentary even. So why do that? We don't, not every question I ask you, by the way, is going to be answered in the bid. This one in particular, I'm not sure they quite deal with. But why would American newspapers describe German POWs like that? Veteran, fit. They look nice, basically. They look like men, is what they say. Why? Describe them that way, do you think?
It kind of makes the Americans look good that they could capture people who were like physically fit and
Okay.
ideal soldiers.
Sure. So one way to take that is like, look at how masculine these German POWs are, right? But, we captured them, so look how badass we are.
I guess it could be a way they could stay fast.
We talk about that too, at a different point, but yes, we also cover how these German POWs in several ways work to maintain their masculinity. Now, a couple things about that. First of all, if we're saying, well, I guess I'll ask you, why do these German POWs feel like they have to maintain their masculinity? What about the situation maybe demands that?
There was a bunch of dudes.
What happened?
There was a bunch of other dudes.
Oh, and you're saying just because like guys around other guys feel like they have to
Yeah, so they won't be
posture, so they don't be what now?
judged or something.
Yeah, no, it's that, like the social sort of pressure. Sure. But beyond that, like specifically about this situation, we're kind of implying something about the status of these German POWs. We're sort of saying they feel like they have to work to maintain their masculinity for one reason or another.
Is it because they're representing Germany?
Kind of. That's kind of a larger conversation. What do you mean by that?
Like, I feel like they got put in the spotlight and they represent like the way Germans are back in Germany. Well,
Okay. There's more to say about that, but we're going to table it for a second. So, I'm going to put it here as like a note. Yeah. More fundamental than that. Who are these German soldiers? What else do we know about them? Other than the fact that they're like fit and veteran and all that stuff, what are they? They're prisoners. Why might they feel like they have to maintain their masculinity? Our student tells us that, right? Gets it from the paper. They feel like they have to maintain it.
They don't have anything else left. I mean, they're a prisoner of war. They don't have anything. What they have is that.
So that implies, right, if we say they have to maintain it, that implies something about their status here demasculates them, emasculates them in a way, right? And maybe it's that prisoner of war status, right? They're under somebody else's thumb, right? Like someone else is telling them when and where to be. They're controlling their day. They don't have power in the situation, right? Yeah. So the other side of that coin is, I forgot how to spell all of a sudden. I think it's two M's. I think that's right. They're emasculated in this situation, which means they feel like they have to maintain their masculinity, right? On that note about representing Germany, let's dig into that a little bit more. What do we mean by that? They feel like they're representing Germany to whom?
To the American people.
Yeah? And so how do they, I'm going to use the verb choose, and that may not be entirely accurate, but how do they go about representing Germany to the American people? What's the picture they give us?
Well, besides their body and stuff, like it also said that they march everywhere they go.
They march everywhere they go. And again, they're in a prison camp. Like that's a little silly. It's a little ridiculous to do that, right? It's pageantry. And you say one reason is because these POWs understand basically whatever the Americans see them do, they're going to take as, oh, that must be how all German soldiers are, right? What are we talking about when we're talking like that? If we view sort of small number of a group and say, well, that's how all of them are. We're talking about the function of stereotypes, right? We're back to that conversation. Absolutely. Now, what's interesting with what you said is that in this particular article, the German POWs are sort of aware of that function, right? They're aware of how that can work, and they try to maybe shape the narrative or live up to the narrative, maybe. I haven't read that article in a little while. It's hard for me to remember. But something about, and I'll erase our note now because we've gotten closer to the idea. It's something about, I'm gonna sum it up this way. This, again, may not be entirely accurate because these are just notes, but sort of living up to the stereotype, the expectation. You know what I'm saying? Because yeah, in the 30s and 40s, early 20th century, German soldiers were seen in a very particular way, and there were certain expectations. One of those expectations might be, even when captured, they fucking march places, you know what I'm saying? They maintain that order, or what have you. Yeah. Okay, very good. Is there anything else from Reese? That's most of it. Oh my goodness, what about this business where they dress up as women? We haven't even brought that up.
With the Germans having no access to women, they often treated the men that acted as women on stage as actual women.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird.
It is. It is. And we take, I'm going to call it a wrong turn only because there could be a better quotation in this article. But the quotation we get in the second half of this paragraph, you could basically sum up as guys in the 30s and 40s didn't think it was okay to be gay and had a problem with it. And I'm like, yeah. Like, we know that, right? You know that before you read this article. You picture, especially a soldier in the 30s or 40s, you're like, hey man, what do you think about gay guys? And he's like, no. We know that, okay? So there could very easily be a better quotation where Reese thinks about why that is or where that comes from. But this particular one just kind of gives us that information. It's like, yeah, we know that. The first half of the paragraph, the very last paragraph though, talks about the fact that some of these German POWs would perform as women on stage, and then off stage they would even get treated like, not just women, I'm going to say submissive women, okay? Like legit, Reese is talking about how these German POWs as women, I can't think about a cleaner term than that, get like slapped on the ass and stuff. That's a very particular relationship between men and women, okay? We make one claim in the first half of this paragraph about that. And I think it's a good one, but it's kind of quick. So I'm going to let you guys scavenger hunt for just a second. Can you find the one claim we make about that information?
They did that to prove their masculinity.
Okay. Now we don't go into why here, but I agree that that's a claim, to start to one. How are they proving their masculinity in this case? Do you guys think? Like, how's that working?
Well, the student says the author described it as obvious that these performers weren't actual women. So, like, it's kind of emasculating the men who are being treated as women, so the ones who treat them feel better.
Okay. So one idea, and this is kind of building on this, right? Like they're maintaining their masculinity in a way. One way to do it, and we talked about this in the last class, is comparatively. You kind of lower somebody else's masculinity to raise your own up, right? Sure. What about the fact that they're pretending to be women? Like they're basically, everyone is agreed implicitly in this German POW camp to say, all right, Ron is a woman now. Everybody's,
So would that mean The agreeing to them?
That's not clear in the bid. I mean, it seems like whether he agrees or not, he's gonna get viewed as one. You know what I'm saying? So, it sounds like to a degree that they agree. Again, that's not clear in the bid. And it's been a while since I've read the, but in either case, they're gonna get viewed like one, right? So again, what we're kind of implying is the pressure to exhibit that masculinity, to sort of play it out, right? It needs women for some reason. So much so that they have guys pretend to be women, right? My question is, why? Why could you argue, and Reese may, but why could you argue they need women so much that some of these guys are going to pretend to be women? Do you think? We're just speculating. We're just kicking around an idea.
I mean, societal standards told them that's kind of what they had to do. Like, I mean, just the idea of an ideal man is you grow up, you get a woman, you have kids, and you support your family.
Mm-hmm.
And like, without the woman part, you can't have kids or a family to support. So,
Well, I mean, to be fair, they're not going to do either one of those things in this camp.
yeah, but like growing up with a particular mindset, you still fight to keep that even when.
Okay, well, and all I'm saying is we got to subtract the last bit of what you said because that can't apply.
Yeah.
But we're trying to figure out what that mindset is here then. So basically, these German men who are pretending to be women can't take on all of this sort of feminine narrative, right? They can only take on certain aspects. They maybe dress a certain way, act a certain way. So those particular aspects, what does that have to do with the masculinity, that seems what we're talking about, of the other German men who keep to go on being men? Like, does that help them in some way? Does it make them feel a certain way about like themselves? To have these other men pretend to be women, you know what I'm saying? Like basically what I'm asking is, what is the function of a woman, apart from the other stuff you said, right? What is the function of a woman and how a woman behaves or how a woman looks in terms of the masculinity of these men? Does that make a little more sense?
I would say that they would have to live up to their standards.
Who's they?
The women that
Okay.
were in the camp, they'd have to live up to how the man wanted them to do.
In terms of like being submissive and whatever.
Yeah, being submissive. And
Okay, but like why? Why would the German men, we're just going to call them German men and German women just to make it easier, but we know what we're saying. Why would the German men want that or need that, or why do you think? Like what's the role of the women in all this? Because again, what we're saying is they need women so badly, they're going to have some of their friends dress up and pretend to be women and get treated like women. That tells me they need them for some reason. They need them real bad.
I guess that's what a normal society is men and women.
Well, but only a certain aspect, right? Like we're oversimplifying. Because when you do that, you're invoking all the things we just took out. They're not going to have kids. They're not going to have families here for reasons that I hope are obvious. So then what we're saying is, without all that, they still need someone to look like a woman and act like a woman. Why? What are their interactions? It doesn't sound like they're taking them to dinner. They're just slapping their ass and like, give me a drink, honey. Like that's what it sounds like, right? So why do they need that particular relationship here, do you think? What's the function of it? What's the value of it? Huh?
It's for the newspaper, I guess. I don't know.
That's a totally different thing. And frankly, I don't know that the German men would have wanted the newspaper to know that they were, you know. All right. We're going to strike out on that one. That's fine. I'm just going to say, you read an article like this and you have Nazi soldiers pretending to be women and getting slapped on the ass. What's up?
They're like fooling around, like doing stuff intimately.
Okay. I'll put it to you this way. You get the sense that these German men might treat, okay, there's no better way for me to say this, real women that way, right? Why? Why? Why would any man treat a woman that way?
It makes them feel more empowered because they have power over the, like, do those things to them.
Maybe. Yeah. And in some way, you have to talk about power when you're treating another person that way, right? And again, this is the 30s and the 40s. People were different, okay? It was a little more like Mad Men, if you've ever seen that show. Great show. First couple seasons, anyway. So to begin with, yeah, it almost seems like, again, they're sort of comparing themselves, but importantly, it's not just that they're less masculine. They're like the ultimate less masculine, right? They're feminine. So what we're saying is the pressure or the desire to maintain their masculinity is so strong, they're willing to have like the sort of antithesis to that masculinity, right? And again, the implication is this is the antithesis to that masculinity. You can't just compare yourself to people that are less masculine. You almost define masculinity according to what it is not, which in this case is feminine. I said a lot back there. I'm hoping you followed some of it. Okay. That's pretty good on Reese, on the bib. Now let's talk about Grant. Grant's a little bit different, right? Talks about, in a way, certain issues that Jarvis doesn't cover, Reese doesn't cover. But I'm telling you right now, I firmly believe we can make this work in this paper. So what are some ideas or some arguments that we get in Grant?
The racial stereotype of black men, how they're,
How it's defined? How is it defined, if you'll help us out real quick?
well, they say it's like hyper-masculine, so it is masculine, but to the point where people are afraid of them.
It's over this. It's hypermasculine, they say hypersexual, and hyperviolent, yes? Okay. And they compare that to the definition of white masculinity, right? What's the definition of white masculinity in the article? And I'm kind of pointing at her, but anybody can give it to us.
It's like being articulate, educated, intelligent, and polite. Is that
What was the last one you said?
polite?
Yeah. So one thing we understand with that quotation is, and we've kind of alluded to this in different ways, but we haven't been able to talk about it yet this semester, is there are different racial definitions of a thing like masculinity, right? Now I say we haven't been able to talk about it yet because we're reading a book by a white dude about other white dudes that he knew, and we actually kind of did that with the first unit, right? That's sort of, these are just books I really like. I didn't, but in this particular article, we're admitting that different communities, different kinds of folks from different backgrounds can have different ideas of what masculinity is. This can be regionalized as well. This can be across different countries as well. But an example I can give you, masculinity in the Deep South, you know, it's probably somewhat different from masculinity in the Pacific Northwest, like in Oregon. They dress differently, they talk differently, one of them watches NASCAR, one of them judges you harshly for watching NASCAR. You know what I'm saying? Like there's different definitions. Same kind of deal here. Now what's important though, those are some very different definitions. One of them is polite and like maybe reads books and stuff. And the other one is hypermasculine, hypersexual, and hyperviolent, which is a problem. The student talks about those. What's the problem with that definition for black masculinity? And there's several, but the student talks about at least one of them here.
One of the ones that I saw underlined
Yeah. What were you going to say too?
was when they said the person who believes these stereotypes aren't necessarily at fault and we should instead look at the people who teach these
Oh, okay.
stereotypes.
I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't get to bring this up in my last class. Avoid should statements. I hate to say it this way, you should avoid should statements. The reason for this is, yes, we should not judge each other by stereotypes. Let's all go ahead and get that out there. But people do, right? That's what the article is about. When you bring in a should statement, this is for this article, this is for Vonnegut, it's for anything. When you bring in a should statement into your paper, you're essentially ignoring what your source is about, right? Like Weary probably shouldn't be into torture as much as he is. We would all agree with that. But he is. You know what I'm saying? And when you go down that should path, you're just sidestepping all the evidence. You're outside of the text now. You're sort of imagining a better world, I think, in most cases. But it's not one we're actually talking about, right? So that aside, yes, the student makes that point. I think we would all agree, but that's not the world we're living in. The point they start to make, they talk about police brutality. They talk about basically how black men get viewed according to that definition, right? According to that stereotype. So we're talking about, on the one hand, the effect sort of on, and again, I'm trying to figure out a way to sum this up, but like people outside of that community or outside of that definition, right? Basically, we're saying they have access to that stereotype and it affects them in this way, right? We also, though, and this is the most interesting aspect of the article to me, we also talk about the effect that this stereotype has on people in the black community. Do you guys see where that's at in the bib? I think it's the last paragraph. I could be wrong about that, though.
It's talking about the good man and like white culture and how they're supposed to be articulate, educated, intelligent, but in the black community, it would be considered gay and bad.
Yeah, so I don't want to, I'm trying real hard to drive you guys to this. I don't want to put words in your head. So what are we saying about, basically what's the effect of this particular stereotype, black masculinity, and how we define it in this article? What's the effect of that on black men then?
Making me seen as a bad man.
By people on the outside, but what, like, I guess what I'm trying to say, how might it shape, according to this article, how might it shape the behavior of those black men? If that makes sense.
They will try to avoid being those things.
Well, but if they do, according to this article, how are they viewed in the black community?
Okay.
Yeah. As a bad man or as homosexual, which, according to this article, according to this definition of masculinity, is kind of the same thing, right? So what we're saying is, this is one point the article makes, and that's one we're unfortunately well aware of these days. Another point the article makes, again, how best to sum this up, it's this. There's, in a completely different way, on the one hand, but also in a very similar way, the article kind of makes the point that black men are pressured to or expected to live up to this stereotype, even within their own community, right? Because when they don't, they're viewed as a bad guy, as homosexual. Thank you. Hate that guy. But what's most interesting here, because again, this article in particular can seem a little bit out of left field. How are we going to make it work with Jarvis? How are we going to make it work with Reese? That's what we're trying to do. That's excellent. I mean, let's be clear, it's a bummer. But in terms of this paper, that works. I think we can do that. Let's make sure we don't have anything else in this article. Those are good points. Is there anything else we're missing? I'm honestly asking because I have to look at my notes too. Talked about stereotypes. Got rid of the should statement. The only other thing I would add, it's kind of in the first paragraph. They also highlight this idea, I guess, about how all of this is comparative, right? You either are or are not a man, not just according to the stereotypes, but we kind of use those standards and compare one kind of a guy to another kind of a guy, right, to determine like where you fall on that spectrum. They talk about that in the first paragraph. All right. So we have enough up here anyway. We can get into more detail, but this is good enough. What I want to do now, the second phase, we're going to talk about introductions. We needed to do all that to do this. First thing we got to do, hopefully this is a review. What are the parts of an introduction? There's 4 of them. Thesis, very good. Oh, slow down, you're too good, okay. Thesis, roadmap, hook if you want one, it's optional, you can have one. And you introduce the text, very good. Now the hard part. What do these mean? What's a hook?
It gets people interested in what you have to say.
You hook them in, right? Again, it's optional, but you guys like to do it. The one note I would give you on a hook, especially for this paper, it can be a rhetorical question. It could be an anecdote, you know, it could be like a cool fact, but it needs to be topical. It needs to be on subject. So my advice to you would be, if you want to have a hook, maybe don't have it be the very first thing you write. Because you don't know what you're going to write about. You kind of do generally, but I would save this for a little later down the line. You might think of something. You might come across something. Really good example, Jarvis, we talk about, most of her first paragraph is a hook. It's way longer than anything you should do, but she gives us that anecdote about Nixon, and that has a lot to do with what she's going to talk about in Vonnegut. That sort of thing. All right, introduce the text. How's that work?
You gotta let people know what you're writing about and who wrote it.
Good. Usually, it's as easy as, I have Fairchild. In Fairchild's Body and Soul, you know, or whatever. However, in this paper, this is a special case, you're going to have at least 4 texts, right? What I don't want anyone to do, and I'm going to stress it now, is list for me your 4 authors and your 4 titles. I know. I say this every semester, and every semester a couple people do it. And it astounds me because when you see it on your paper, it has to confound you as well. In Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, and in Jarvis's that long-ass title, and then these other 2 people and their long-ass title, right? That's insane. It's just all this text. Don't do that. Please don't do that. More to the point. Technically speaking, that's not really our text in this paper, okay? We have, if we're this student, these 2, and we also have Vonnegut and Jarvis. Typically, Vonnegut would kind of be your primary source, right? And he sort of is here. He's going to be in a lot of your paper. He doesn't have to be in every paragraph, first of all. He can be. Some of you will be in every paragraph. That's fine. He doesn't have to be. That's not our focus, okay? Our focus in this paper is the conversation between these texts, okay? So another way of putting that, and we're going to start taking some notes now if we can on how we might build this. I've already said we don't know what the hook is. We might come back to that later. We're going to introduce the text. Thinking of Reese and what we had to say about it, thinking of Grant, what we had to say about it. You're going to have to use your memories for Vonnegut and for Jarvis, but we have talked about them. If you were to try right now to sum up whatever the conversation is between these texts, what are some common themes or some common concerns they bring up? We're not even making arguments yet. We're just saying they talk about this stuff.
Stereotypes.
What was it?
Like stereotypes.
Okay, stereotypes. Can we get a little more specific?
The stereotype of masculinity.
Oftentimes, like masculine standards, right? That'd be one. Okay. Can anybody think of anything else? That's pretty good.
I feel like Jarvis and Vonnegut, they kind of talk about war.
Yeah. And in a way, like how it's kind of tied to those masculine standards, sort of, or they're linked somehow, right? Okay. We could go further on that, but I'm not going to berate you with that question. So for right now, if we were just starting the paper, right, we're just starting the introduction, masculine standards, and somehow, we haven't solved it yet, how they're tied to war. Okay. Now the point I want to make here, just like we talked about topic sentences when we write body paragraphs, you haven't written that body paragraph, so you only have a loose idea at best about what it's actually going to be about. So I tell you time and time again, after you write the body paragraph, you need to go back, you need to look at that topic sentence. And you're like, well, what did I end up saying, right? Probably need to revise the topic sentence at the very least. Same's going to go for here. Most of you, I'm going to tell you not to, but most of you are probably going to start with your introductions. You have your reasons. I know most of them. We don't have to talk about it. But if you start with your introduction, like you're going to do, what I'm telling you now is your introduction to the text. I think all of us are going to roundabout, I mean, your other two texts will be different, but it's going to be similar to this, okay? That's fine. You're going to get more specific. You just are. You're going to write the paper. You're going to figure some shit out, basically. So I'm telling you, this will probably need to change, okay? At worst, it'll just get more specific. You'll figure out more about how it's tied to war, or you end up saying something else. You're like, oh yeah, that should be in my introduction to the text, right? You need to revise this. This is a rough draft. All that out of the way. Roadmap. This is primarily what we're going to do with the rest of our time, actually. For the roadmap, well, I'll ask you, how does a roadmap work in these papers?
You lay out the way that the paper's going to go.
Good. And that's why I call it a roadmap, right? Like this should help us understand in some detail what we're going to see in the rest of the paper. Now, obviously, you get more detailed in your body paragraphs. But your big ideas, you kind of break them down for me here. Of course, that leads to the thesis. The thesis is meant to sum up your paper. And if that's true, well, then your roadmap should also help us understand how that works, right? Okay. In terms of the roadmap, again, we're going to have to use our memory a little bit. But if I was a student and I was sitting down to start this paper, I have my Reese notes, my Grant notes. I'm also going to have my Vonnegut and my Jarvis notes. We got to think about ways to start connecting these texts, right?
Right.
Good. What do you guys think? I mean, again, we can start with Reese and Grant because they're up here. But if Vonnegut or Jarvis come in at some point, absolutely let us know. Do you guys see anywhere with Reese or Grant we could make connections? We could start to put them into conversation.
Talk of like comparative masculinity.
Okay. To recap, if we could, how's that work in Reese?
They kind of emasculate other men in order to feel better about themselves.
Okay, so it's a I guess one way to talk about that, and yeah, I mean we'll connect them. One way to talk about it over here is it's a power relationship or a power dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
One guy has the power and one doesn't, so we need to. That's how we determine who's like more masculine. Okay. What about in Grant? How do we talk about it there? Comparative masculinity, the idea that you know when someone is masculine or when someone is more masculine only because you measure them against somebody else.
Would it be like a racial comparison?
Could be. What do you mean by that?
Like you taking the stereotypes that they have for black men and comparing them with the stereotypes they have for white men.
Well, I wonder if we do that, all we're going to say is that like they're different and one is inherently more negative than the other, right?
I think it's kind of like there's like a pre-established societal rule book that if you're not X, Y, and Z, then you're not masculine.
Mm-hmm.
So the comparison is either you're this or you're not, and if you're not, then like.
Okay. Well, maybe. All right, so look, I got one thing to say, and then we can make that work, or we could do another thing, but either one would be fine. What we have to remember, we have to make our texts work together. So it's not just, these ideas are the same, and they kind of are, right? Who are we talking about here? In this text, we're talking about German POWs. So that involves their American captors, that involves the American public in different ways. But in this particular idea, we're just talking about the Germans. Derek, you're going to be a lady. What? I need this, right? So it's just them. So in this case, we have to be that kind of specific. So I don't know if we can talk about white and black masculinity, right? It has to be one or the other to sort of to parallel that. And this article seems to, it's mostly about black masculinity, so let's focus on that. And I've lost my train of thought. What did you say a minute ago?
There's a set of like societal rules that you have to live up to.
That could be one. Okay. All right. So one direction we could head in. And we're just drafting on the fly, right? One idea would be if we synthesize Rees and Grant, we're talking about this notion of sort of comparative masculinity. And basically, because this is a thing, right? Because we recognize in these two texts that comparative masculinity is a real thing, that's one of the primary ways we measure whether or not somebody is like manly. That this brings with it a pressure to conform to those standards, right? Now here's what's important. Elizabeth, I think the way you were phrasing it was like pressure to conform from the outside. Is that fair? Okay, so the American captors in this case, and the sort of dominant culture in this case, white America, however you want to phrase it, sort of pressures those groups to conform to those standards. Everybody with me so far? Okay. I'm just gonna, again, we're just making notes, so I'm trying to find real fast ways to sum this up. And that's like from the perspective of the dominant culture. What's interesting to me is we also, in both of those articles, cover the perspective of the minority culture. So here we're talking about black men. Here we're talking about German POWs in an American prison camp, right? They're the minority culture in that case. What's their perspective? Trying to find a better way to say this. Or like what's their understanding of, how do these standards affect their behavior in Rees and in Grant? Because again, I think we could find a parallel. We could talk about, interestingly, how they kind of work in the same sort of way.
I feel like in both senses, people are still like maintaining a masculine kind of facade. Like the first one, it really talks about maintaining masculinity, but the next one, it talks about how people go out of their way to not be seen as, like, it's specifically in black culture, how they go out of their way to not be seen as masculine in the eyes of like white culture. So they're trying to like maintain their culture's idea of masculinity.
Yeah, that particular definition,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. So again, and here's what's interesting, because we're used to this first idea, right? Dominant culture exerts some kind of pressure to conform to those standards. We know that. Okay. I can't think of a better way to, I'm going to say what's kind of cool. I don't mean it's great. But like what's kind of interesting in these two articles too, because it investigates the minority culture and like sort of how they deal with that, is those minority cultures in Rees and in Grant also seem to exert pressure on people within their communities, right? Like the stupid example I gave, Derek, you're a lady today. And he's like, what? It's like, I need this. Even if Derek doesn't want to be a lady, right? Like you kind of reference to like, did they choose this? It's not clear in the bid, but it definitely seems like whether they wanted it or not, it was going to happen. Derek, you have nice legs. You have to be the lady. You can almost see it being a decision made like that. Same thing in Grant. The definition is not a nice one. of black masculinity in the article. But you see sort of within the black community in Grant how those men get read if they don't fit that stereotype, right? That's from within the minority community, so there's pressure there too. Was that all clear? I tried to be as cogent as I could. Okay. And importantly, real quick, none of us are saying these are arguments we're making. We're simply making our articles sing together, okay? But when you put those up to next to each other, two very different scenarios, you start to kind of find parallels. They're not so different in a way. And this is one idea, or technically I suppose two ideas that kind of come out of that. Yeah. Okay. If we could, I think we have time. Yeah, we got time. If we could try to involve Vonnegut and or Jarvis in this conversation. I know, you have to use your memory now. We did talk about Vonnegut for like 3 weeks or something, so I mean. But anytime, I mean, again, let's be clear, what we're talking about is generally the pressure to conform to these masculine standards, right? That's what we're talking about. But we're also talking about the power of those masculine standards. Like, in Vonnegut or Jarvis, do they ever shape anyone's behavior or anyone's perspective? Do they ever push a character into a certain situation or a certain way of doing things? That would be Vonnegut. In Jarvis, does she ever talk about, I guess in this case primarily men, how they might be molded in a way or made to do a thing? I asked you a lot, I'm sorry.
I could say for like Jarvis with the John Wayne movies, they could somewhat be molded to become a soldier.
Okay, the Sands of Iwo Jima example.
Yeah.
How so? I'm with you. I just want to.
It's because they watch the movies and they see how glorious it looks, and they're like, I want to have that as well. I feel like they enlist in the military to go fight in the war.
Okay, so, and here's what's interesting about that. In that particular case, I agree with you. Strictly, Jarvis isn't necessarily, I mean, we don't use the language of stereotypes there, right? We talk about, like, narrative. We have a narrative as a culture about how war works. And we see that played out in movies. Absolutely. But, so Jarvis is talking about the sort of power of those narratives. You see it for everybody, anyone who may not remember the situation we're describing here. A bunch of young men, and assuming, a few women, but this is like the 50s, go to see a war movie. John Wayne's in it, Sands of Iwo Jima. And when they come out of that theater, Marine recruiters are in the lobby, and these dudes are just lining up. And the way Jarvis reads that is, they saw the movie, they see the recruiters, and they clearly think, as you say, oh, that looks great, I want to do that. But we understand, with what little we know of war, I mean, I've never been in it, probably not like the John Wayne movies, it's probably a little different, probably a little harder. We could start there, right? But you get the sense that they're not really appreciating that. They don't really know that. So they think they're signing up for this narrative. It exerts a certain power over them, over their behavior, over their lives. You sign up for the military, that's kind of a done thing in a lot of cases. It'd be hard to get out of, right? So the power of those narratives. Now when I say narrative, again, I do think, as you rightfully, and I'm forgetting your name, sir, I'm so sorry.
Ajor.
What?
Ajor.
One more time?
Did you ask my name?
Yeah, man.
Ajor.
With your chest, please.
Ajor.
Ijor?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I just know you as the hat guy.
Yeah.
You said you had a collection. So. Anyway, we're talking about narratives in a similar way to how we're talking about stereotypes now, right? The pressure, the power those stereotypes seem to have works as a kind of narrative in the way that Jarvis is talking about war narratives. You feel me on that? A little bit? Okay.
I feel like there's also kind of like a sense of masculinity that gets projected onto like being a soldier. 'Cause,
Sure.
like, everybody expects that, like, in the 50s, the average man is pretty patriotic. And
Sure.
what's more patriotic and manly than being in the army?
Well, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked about old men playing basketball. The guy in army fatigues, but then also house shoes, right? Even now, 2020, you read army fatigues a certain kind of way, right? And it has a lot of those associations you're alluding to. Not just patriotism, but one of the manliest guys you can think of. We're all using those standards. He might be in army fatigues, right? He may have served, and that's a certain narrative around those stereotypical expectations, right? Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can kind of connect it there as well in terms of sort of furthering these masculine stereotypes, sure. Lastly, we gotta at least get Vonnegut involved. Can we think of, we have 3 different kind of scenarios, one from each of these texts. Can we think of anything from Vonnegut we could try to, start to, put into conversation with those folks? We see like the power of a narrative, or we see like a pressure to conform to certain standards. Do we see the way it shapes anybody in Vonnegut? Or does it move any of these characters in certain directions? Anything at all? I know you guys don't care. I can think of so many characters. It's all through this book.
You could maybe do his conversation with the wife, how she was like, you can't make this look like glamorous.
Mary and the narrator. Okay. Yeah. Does anybody, do you guys remember that conversation? She kind of comes at the narrator. She says, you're going to write a particular kind of war story. Specifically, what kind of war story? Well, no, she's worried he's going to...
Not
Yeah, he's going to have certain people could play in a movie.
John Wayne.
Frank Sinatra. Yeah. She's worried he's going to write a story like Sands of Iwo Jima. She knows about that narrative. And you could argue she knows about the power of that narrative because she says it's going to basically make more wars happen. They're going to be fought by the babies, like the babies upstairs, she says. When we talked last class about those babies, she's talking about innocence there, like lack of experience. I'll put it to you, those 18, 19-year-old guys who saw Sands of Iwo Jima in like 1950 or whatever, and go to sign up to be Marines, they're dumb as hell. They lack experience. They don't know that it's not like that. They don't know that, let's be real, they're being tricked right now. That's what that is. They don't know that. They're kind of babies in terms of the world, right? They're testing the sirens today. I got an email. You probably did too, but let's be real about your relationship with your inboxes right now. Anyway, that's a test. It is hella distracting though. All right, so Jarvis and Vonnegut, he also talks about the power of these narratives with Mary. Christ. And basically how the narrator is going to try to work against them. He's going to write a story, he tells her, that can't be made into one of those movies. Can't be used to trick young men in the case of Sands of Iwo Jima, right? He's going to write a different narrative. And again, I'll put it to you. Hopefully you guys have read the book by now. Okay. Can't really make a movie out of this, right? Some of you, I wager, had a hard time following some of this. Now imagine trying to shoot it like a film. Exactly. So maybe he did his job. Okay. What we have at this stage, just to recap. I mentioned we don't have a hook right now. Save that for later. Don't even worry about it. Intro to the text. Masculine standards, somehow tied to war. And look at that. I think we kind of ended up talking about that, didn't we? I think we kind of did. But we got way more specific. Not just masculine standards in this case, especially with Grant. It's a very, he talks a very different kind of masculine standard. You could also argue in Reese, that's a national masculine standard, right? These German men are expected to be German men, not just men. That's a different thing. We started to kind of get at how it might be tied to war, right? Especially with Jarvis. It's something to do with how these standards are like represented or how they're told to us, how we ingest them. Something like that is what we're starting to talk about here. And then in Vonnegut with Mary, we talk about the fact that they're aware of that narrative in the book. They're aware of its power. And so they try to work around it some way. What we have here is a really good start to an introduction. Okay? I'm going to talk about a thesis in a minute. Don't worry about it. I know you guys are really looking forward to that. But at this stage, I think we have at least 2 good body paragraphs. We got a really good start with Reese and Grant with 1. I think we got a really good start to like transition to Jarvis and Vonnegut, probably. I say probably because you'd have to write the paragraphs. You'd have to see what happens, you know. But that seems to be where we're headed. What that means is, say that this helps this particular student come up with 2 body paragraphs. Awesome. That's not the whole paper. But they write those 2 body paragraphs, there's a very good chance they're going to have an idea of where to go after that, right? That 3rd body paragraph, whatever it is, it ends up being, is also going to need to be in the roadmap, right? Think about how long this paper is. Maybe at best they have 1 more body paragraph after that. But my point is, you got to go, after you get started, this is a good start, go to that body of the paper. Work on those paragraphs in the way that we've talked about. And then you can add to this. You can come back to this. You're not going to know all of this up front. Specifically when it comes to the thesis. The thesis, we're trying to sum up the paper, right? We haven't written the paper. How could you do that? A note on the thesis. I say this for my sanity. In the prompt, there's a sample thesis. And what that means is that most of you, at some point, will find that sample thesis, and you will copy and paste that thing into your paper. That's okay. I hate it, but that's okay, and I understand why you do it. But here's what I'm telling you. The sample thesis, it reads something like, while there is disagreement about X and Y, there is a general consensus about Z. I might have those reversed, but you get the point. It reads like that. All I'm saying in that sample thesis is I'm giving you a boilerplate way to try to organize a lot of information, right? So, to borrow that boilerplate from this, there does seem to be general agreement about the pressure to conform to stereotypes, that could be X, and the power of certain cultural narratives, that might be our Y. However, there could be some disagreement about what could be done about those narratives, or how that pressure might work within a minority community, right? Something like that. You have to write the paper to figure that part out. But my point is, you can get way more specific than that sample thesis. It is legit just there to give you an idea of how to approach this. You do not have to copy and paste it. And I say that because I'm going to get like 100 papers. And if like 80 of you, which is usually about the number, copy and paste it, I read 80 the same fucking thing. It just kills me. But you can be more specific. The ways you guys are talking about these texts, which again, those 2 texts, most of you are not using, to my knowledge, but you were able to talk about them, right? We got some specific ideas up here. You do the same work with your stuff, whatever it is. Once you do that, your thesis will be different, probably. Any questions about anything we talked about today? Anything at all? Yes, sir.
So you could honestly, you can come back to do the thesis later as well.
That's what I'm recommending. Again, I know in your heart of hearts, most of you are not cool with that idea, and I get that too. My advice would be, if you're going to try a thesis early, okay, But the same way we talked about the introduction to the text, you're gonna get way more specific. You're gonna come up with other ideas, you're gonna make other points. You need to know later in the process, you gotta come back to the thesis. And I would wager probably rewrite it. Not just revise, but rewrite it would be my advice. But yeah, I guess one way to phrase it is your real thesis you're gonna do later. Yeah. Other questions? That was a good one. Okay. I have no idea what time it is. Oh, it's 12:08. Sweet. I was gonna have you guys draft a little bit, but it's 12:08, so like, no. However, I have a couple more things to talk at you about. These are just notes, sort of making sure we're all on the same page as far as like what's coming up, okay? This weekend, we have a couple things due. Number one, 2 more bibs, okay? Some of you have done it already. If you haven't, you want to do that, okay? Those are due on course 10. You also have a rough draft due to turn it in. Now I know, bibs being due, rough draft being due, that can feel like kind of a lot. However, you get your rough draft turned in on Saturday in some form or fashion, you get it done. That means you have a week to figure out your final draft. That's going to feel pretty good come Sunday, Monday. You're like, at least I have all that behind me, right? Take some of the pressure off, I promise. Now that said, you also have a revision due on Saturday. That one is optional. It is. But again, I am firmly recommending everyone take advantage of the opportunity. Yes, ma'am?
So the off chance our revised paper is worse than the first one?
I won't ding you for that.
Okay.
I will be annoyed, but I won't, yeah. Fair question. A sunnier way to put that is if you do better, I do replace your grade, okay? Like some teachers average them, I don't do that. I straight up replace it. If you've done the work and it's better, I reward you for that work, okay? And again, every semester, some students, for whatever reason, didn't do so hot on the first paper, so you got like a D. I know you're not happy about that. Sometimes those students pull like B's on the revision. You know what I'm saying? Like it can be that kind of a jump. I'm just putting it out there. But the other thing I would say about revisions, I said this in the video. I really hope you guys watch those. I feel like sometimes you don't, which sucks. But what I said last time, and I'll make it real short, is the work I've seen from you guys in this unit in particular, in the bibs in particular, I think all of you, at least again, the people that are turning in homework, but the stuff I've seen, I think you're much more capable now in terms of the conversation we're trying to have this semester, okay? So yeah, this unit, we're talking about Vonnegut, we're talking about Jarvis, we're talking about our other articles, but all these ideas, a lot of them anyway, can also be applied to Fairchild, right? If you go back and read your first paper with what you know now or what you're kind of kicking around now, you'll be surprised at what you're like, oh man, I can't believe I just totally didn't talk about this, right? Or just totally moved past this line, right? You will be surprised with what you have kicking around now. And so I say I think a lot of you are much better prepared intellectually, okay, for the first paper. Now, a lot of you also had structural issues with the first paper. That's stuff you got to sort out. But in terms of ideas, I think you could do much better. That's my recommendation for everybody revising. I think you would do better. Last thing I want to remind you of, and then I'll let you go. Everything I just said is due this Saturday. It's been due this Saturday all semester. So if somebody comes up to me after class and is like, this is too much, I'm going to say, this should not be a surprise. Next week, because you guys are my last class of the week, I just want to remind everybody what's coming up, okay? Next week, we have peer review, which I believe the way Turnitin works, it won't really let you do unless you turn in a rough draft. So there's that. Peer review, very low stakes. Final draft will be due next week, next Saturday, right? Again, I'm hoping that's not a surprise, but there it is. Last thing, Die Hard. You're going to need to get access to that movie sometime next week. We're going to watch it the week after that, okay? But you need to figure out some way to watch that movie. You don't have to buy it necessarily. This is 2020. Who buys movies? But you got to find a way to watch it once or twice. Okay? I know it's on some streaming platforms. I'm not sure which ones. We might talk about that next week or something. It is out there. It's kind of a famous movie. Has anybody ever seen it? Excellent. No, I mean it. It's an 80s action movie.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so it's like probably very different from most of what you may watch in other classes a lot of the time. There's a famous line in the film, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker. Anyway, that sums up the movie really well. But you need to start the third unit, be able to watch that movie here in the next week or two, right? So just at some point in your downtime, if you have access to certain streaming platforms or something like that, just know you got to get access to that movie. Worst case scenario, I did buy a copy because I don't trust our internet all the time, so I bring in a DVD, but I got it for like $5 on Amazon when it was on sale once because it's an old movie. So that could be an option too. I'm just saying you got to look around a little bit.